In the chaos of World War II, when bullets ruled the sky and tanks crushed the earth beneath them, victory often depended not on strength, but on deception. Today we uncover one of the most remarkable, least-known stories of the war, a secret American unit that didn't fight with rifles or bombs. Instead, they fought with paintbrushes, rubber, speakers, and imagination. They were artists, designers, actors, magicians, soldiers trained to turn illusion into a weapon. This is the story of the Ghost Army, the invisible warriors who helped win the war without firing a shot.
In early 1944, deep inside a heavily guarded American training camp, a group of young men arrived carrying not rifles, but sketchbooks. Instead of battle maps, they brought paint palettes. Some wore glasses too thick for shooting. Others had hands used to drawing portraits, not pulling triggers. To any normal soldier, they looked completely out of place. But that was exactly the point. These men had been chosen for something extraordinary, something so secret that even most U.S. generals had never heard of it. Their orders were simple, yet unbelievable. Make the enemy believe you are an entire army, when in reality, you are barely 1,100 men. This unit would later be formally known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but history would remember them by a far more legendary name, the Ghost Army. The mission born from desperation. By 1943, the Allies faced a massive problem. The German military was extremely skilled at reading troop movements, intercepting signals, and preparing ambushes. Whenever the Allies tried to launch an attack, the Germans often seemed to know ahead of time, as if they could see the future. The solution wasn't more force, it was more creativity. Somewhere in Washington, a few groundbreaking military thinkers asked a bold question. If the Germans can see our movements, then why not make them see the wrong thing? Instead of increasing the number of tanks or soldiers, what if they faked them? What if they built an army that looked powerful from the outside, but on the inside was nothing but air? This idea was so unconventional, so outrageous, that many high-ranking officials laughed when they first heard it. But General Eisenhower didn't laugh. He saw potential. A chance to save thousands of lives by using deception instead of bloodshed. And so, the Ghost Army was born. The recruitment: artists, musicians, and tricksters. Unlike normal soldiers, the men selected for the Ghost Army came from some of the most unusual backgrounds. Artists from New York art schools, Hollywood set designers, sound engineers from top studios, graphic designers and illustrators, actors who knew how to fake emotions and movements. They weren't chosen for their ability to kill. They were chosen for their ability to create illusions. Some would design inflatable tanks made from rubber. Some would record real battlefield sounds and play them back through giant speakers. Some would sew fake insignias onto their uniforms and pretend to be officers. And all of them would become masters at fooling the German army. One soldier famously joked, "Our weapons were paint, air pumps, and radio microphones. And somehow, we were supposed to scare the entire German army." Training for a war of illusion. Unlike normal soldiers, the Ghost Army did not train with rifles or grenades. Their training ground looked more like a film studio than a battlefield. 1. Inflatable tanks and artillery. The first time they saw the weapons they were supposed to use, many burst into laughter. In front of them stood huge tanks made of rubber. cannons that weighed almost nothing, jeeps that could be lifted by one man, artillery guns that deflated like balloons. At first glance, these looked ridiculous. But from the air, where German reconnaissance planes watched, they looked absolutely real. All the artists had to do was paint shadows, add fake mud on the tires, and place them strategically on fields. Within hours, a meadow could appear to hold a battalion of tanks. 2. Sonic deception. Another group trained in sound warfare. They used giant speakers mounted on trucks, capable of projecting sound up to 15 miles. They recorded tank engines, marching soldiers, bridges being built, entire armored columns moving. Then, late at night, they would play these recordings at full volume, making the Germans believe that thousands of troops were approaching, even when the real army was miles away. In many battles, this simple trick convinced enemy commanders to move divisions into the wrong area, weakening their defenses where the real attack would eventually come. 3. Radio trickery. The radio operators had a unique mission: pretend to be many units at once. They learned to mimic the communication patterns of real divisions, the slang, the rhythm, even the personal habits of officers they had never met. If a real American division was moving south, the Ghost Army would fake their radio signals in the north, making the enemy believe they were still there. 4. The art of acting. Finally, there was a strange but essential part of training. They learned to act. Sometimes they needed to pretend to be drunk officers in a bar so that German spies would overhear misleading information. Sometimes they had to stage entire camps full of activity, even though there were barely 100 men in the area. They created fake laundry lines, fake kitchens with smoke, fake supply depots, fake command posts with maps. Everything had to look alive. One officer put it perfectly: if a German spy looked at our camp for even 1 minute, he had to believe we were a division of 20,000 men. Their first real test, Normandy, 1944. After months of training, the Ghost Army had their first real mission, one that would determine whether their strange skills mattered or whether the entire project would be seen as a failure. It was June 1944. The beaches of Normandy had just been stormed. The Allies needed time to prepare for their next big push into France. But the German army was watching closely. If they figured out where the next attack would come from, thousands of Allied soldiers could die. So the Ghost Army stepped into the shadows. Operation Elephant. Their job was to impersonate the 6th Armored Division, a real unit that was secretly moving south. If the Germans realized the division had moved, it would expose a critical weakness in the Allied line. So the Ghost Army set up hundreds of inflatable tanks, miles of fake tire tracks, sound trucks playing tank movements, radio operators mimicking the 6th Division. To any observer, it looked like a massive force preparing for an attack. German scouts reported the presence of a large division. German intelligence confirmed it through intercepted radio chatter. The deception worked perfectly. For 3 crucial days, the Germans believed the 6th Division was still in the area. This gave the real unit enough time to reposition without being detected. It was the Ghost Army's first victory, one with air, paint, and sound. The danger no one talks about. Though they were an art-based unit,
The Ghost Army's missions were extremely dangerous. They operated close to the front lines, sometimes less than 1 kilometer from enemy positions. If the Germans discovered that the tanks were made of rubber, or that the soldiers were actors and artists, they would be wiped out instantly. They carried rifles, but everyone knew that if they were attacked, their chances of survival were slim. One member later said, "We weren't allowed to fire first. Our mission was to make noise, not take bullets." But the greatest challenge was yet to come. Normandy was only the beginning. Ahead of them was the operation that would define their legacy. An illusion so daring, so elaborate, that even German generals would be fooled. This operation would save an entire American division from destruction and prove that sometimes the greatest weapon in war is imagination.
Their work after Normandy was far more dangerous than anyone outside the unit ever knew. The Ghost Army was no longer simply experimenting with inflatable tanks and sound tricks. Now they were being sent into active combat zones where real German divisions could attack them at any moment. Every mission required them to act like a giant military force, even when they were only a handful of men standing between the German army and the real American troops. The summer of 1944 was brutal. After the Allied breakout from Normandy, the Germans were retreating across France, but they were far from defeated. They were skilled, disciplined, and unpredictable. Sometimes they retreated fast, sometimes they turned around and attacked with sudden force. Any unit operating near the front line lived in constant fear. The Ghost Army, despite being an art unit, was placed directly in harm's way. Their next major deception mission was around the French town of Brest. The Germans had dug in and were ready to defend the port at any cost. The Allies needed every real unit they had for direct assaults, so they sent the Ghost Army ahead to create the illusion of a massive buildup. Their job was to convince the Germans that thousands of American soldiers, tanks, and artillery were surrounding the region, even though no such force existed. To make the deception believable, the Ghost Army spread out over a large area. They inflated dozens of fake Sherman tanks and placed them behind hedgerows and small hills. Engineers used trucks to drag metal chains across the dirt, creating long lines of tire tracks that looked like heavy armored vehicles had crossed the fields. Sound trucks played the noise of tanks moving, engines roaring, and soldiers shouting. From a distance, it sounded like an entire armored division was preparing to storm Brest. Patrols were sent out wearing fake unit patches. They walked confidently through nearby villages, drinking in cafes, talking loudly, making sure local residents and any German spies saw them. They made sure the enemy would hear that the 6th Armored Division and the 2nd Infantry Division were preparing for a massive attack. In reality, those divisions were nowhere near the area. It was only the Ghost Army, all 1,100 of them, performing a show for the enemy. One of the most dangerous tasks was at night. Teams would sneak as close as possible to German lines and place inflatable tanks in the open. These tanks could be set up in minutes, but deflated just as fast. If the Germans decided to fire artillery at them, the soldiers could only hope they would be quick enough to escape. Many men described the sound of German shells passing overhead while they knelt next to their rubber vehicles, pumping air as fast as they could. During the Brest operation, the Germans fell for the act. Their commanders repositioned artillery and reserves toward the fake divisions, easing pressure on the real Allied troops attacking the port. The deception saved hundreds of lives and allowed the Allies to capture Brest faster than expected. But the Ghost Army could not celebrate for long. They were soon sent to one of the most intense deception missions of the entire war, a mission near the city of Metz. The Germans considered Metz almost sacred, a fortress city with huge defensive walls, bunkers, and anti-tank barriers. To help the real American forces break through, the Ghost Army needed to pretend to be a major armored unit preparing for an assault from another direction.
This mission was extremely dangerous because the Ghost Army had to operate within range of German artillery. If the enemy ever discovered they were a small deception unit, they could be wiped out instantly. Still, the artists got to work. They placed their inflatable tanks in realistic formations, painted with mud and shadows so they would look convincing from the air. Sound trucks were placed behind tree lines, projecting the noise of tank engines and metal clattering. At night, they lit fake campfires and made silhouettes of troops moving in the dark, even though there were hardly any men on the ground. Radio operators ran full simulated traffic using the identity of a real American armored division. They created fake reports, fake requests, even fake arguments between officers. Everything was designed to be exactly like the real division style. German intelligence intercepted the signals and believed the deception fully. At one point, German patrols got so close that Ghost Army soldiers could hear them talking. A few men hid inside an inflatable tank, terrified that the slightest touch would reveal the truth. If a German soldier poked the tank with a rifle, the entire illusion would collapse. But the patrol passed quietly, and the deception continued. The mission at Metz worked. The Germans shifted their defenses to face the non-existent armored division, allowing the real Allied troops to break through a weak point and advance faster. Once again, the artists had outsmarted trained military strategists. Despite these successes, the Ghost Army paid a heavy price. During one of the missions, they were spotted by German artillery observers. Within minutes, shells started raining down on their position. Several sound trucks and supply vehicles were destroyed. A few men were injured by shrapnel. One soldier later said that he never forgot the sound of rubber tanks popping like balloons when artillery hit them. But even through the chaos, they continued their performance. As soon as the shelling stopped, they inflated more tanks and moved them to new positions. The show had to go on. By late 1944, the Ghost Army had become masters at fooling German intelligence. Their biggest challenge came when the Germans launched a huge surprise attack known as the Battle of the Bulge. Tens of thousands of German troops crashed into Allied lines in Belgium, pushing deep into American territory. It was freezing, chaotic, and deadly. Units were cut off, communications were scrambled, and commanders were desperate for any advantage. The Ghost Army was rushed to the front. Their mission was not to deceive the Germans this time, but to help cover the retreat of real American units. They had to make it appear that strong forces were holding the line, even though the area was dangerously thin. They set up inflatable tanks in snowy fields. They played sounds of artillery and armored vehicles, even though there were none. They made fake radio traffic suggesting entire regiments were present. Their performance convinced German reconnaissance that the American flank was stronger than it really was, slowing the German advance and buying precious time. This mission was one of the most terrifying because the Ghost Army could be attacked at any moment. They were not trained for heavy combat. Their weapons were for self-defense only. If the German armored divisions had turned toward them, they would not have survived. But luck and skill helped them endure. After the Battle of the Bulge, the Ghost Army moved into Germany as the Allies advanced eastward. By now, their reputation among certain commanders was growing, though officially, almost no one was allowed to speak of them. Their greatest mission was still ahead, Operation Viersen, the grand deception that would be remembered as their finest hour.
Operation Viersen took place in March 1945 as the Allies prepared to cross the Rhine River, one of the last major natural barriers protecting Germany. Crossing the Rhine required massive troop movements, bridging equipment, and armored support. If the Germans knew where the Americans planned to cross, they could launch a devastating counterattack. So the Ghost Army was assigned to create a huge fake buildup miles away from the real crossing point. They built enormous camps filled with inflatable tanks, fake artillery, and rubber boats. They played the sounds of soldiers building bridges, trucks arriving, and engineers working day and night. They even set up fake headquarters with maps, radio chatter, and supply depots. Hundreds of dummies were positioned to look like troops digging trenches or resting. Local civilians saw the activity and assumed thousands of soldiers were preparing for an assault. German scouts reported the same thing. From the air, the deception looked perfect. The Germans shifted their attention to the fake location, leaving the real crossing point less defended. When the Allies finally crossed the Rhine, the operation succeeded with far fewer casualties. Operation Viersen became the Ghost Army's greatest masterpiece. By the end of the war, the Ghost Army had carried out more than 20 major deception missions. Their illusions saved tens of thousands of lives and helped shorten the war. Yet nobody knew about them. Their missions were classified for decades. The men went home quietly, unable to tell anyone what they had done. They received no medals, no recognition, no public thanks. They were heroes who had to keep their heroism a secret. Only many years later did the world learn about the Ghost Army and the incredible creativity, courage, and imagination that helped defeat one of the strongest military forces in history.
The final phase of the Ghost Army's journey began as the war neared its end, but their missions became even more dangerous than before. Germany was collapsing, its cities in ruins, its supply lines broken, yet the remaining German divisions were still capable of launching deadly counterattacks. In this chaotic final stretch of the war, the Ghost Army played one of the most important roles of World War II, deceiving the enemy long enough for the Allied forces to deliver the final blow. In early 1945, as American troops moved deeper into Germany, every river crossing and every road became a vital point of strategy. The German High Command knew that if they could predict where the Allies would strike next, they could slow the advance, regroup their scattered forces, and prolong the war. This made deception more valuable than ever, and the Ghost Army found themselves in constant motion. Their final major deception began near the towns close to the Rhine River. Germany had pulled many of its remaining units behind the river to make a last stand. The Allies needed to cross the Rhine without suffering huge casualties. The real crossing point was kept secret. The Ghost Army was assigned to draw German attention miles away from the true assault location. They set up hundreds of fake tanks and artillery pieces. Rubber trucks were placed in rows, and soldiers painted shadows and dents to make them look used. Engineers built fake pontoon bridges that would never hold a real tank but looked convincing from a distance. Sound crews played recordings of engines, construction equipment, and entire battalions preparing to cross the river. At night, the deception became even more realistic. Lights flickered across the riverbanks like vehicle reflections. Fires burned in controlled pits, giving the impression of large camps. Dummy soldiers were positioned near trees to look like guards. Every small detail had to appear authentic. One mistake could expose the entire operation. Meanwhile, the radio team performed one of their most complex simulations. They created full radio traffic for a division that did not exist in the area. Fake officers argued, requested fuel, asked for supplies, and complained about weather conditions. Everything was timed perfectly to sound real. German intelligence intercepted the messages and believed they had found the main Allied crossing point. Reports reached German commanders claiming a massive river assault was coming. They shifted troops, artillery, and armor toward the fake location. This gave the real American forces precious time to prepare for the actual crossing many miles away. When the real assault began, it faced far less resistance than predicted. The Germans had been misled by the Ghost Army. The Rhine crossing became a major turning point of the war, and the Ghost Army's deception played a critical role in its success. But the mission came with great danger. German reconnaissance planes flew overhead daily, taking photographs. If one inflatable tank looked wrong or one radio message sounded unusual, everything could collapse.
Several times, German artillery shells landed close to Ghost Army positions. Soldiers hid behind rubber tanks, silently hoping the enemy would never realize what they were shooting at. Some joked later that they were the only soldiers who prayed their tanks would never be hit. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, the Ghost Army continued performing smaller deceptions. They created fake camps, false supply depots, and misleading troop movements. But the war was nearing its end. German resistance weakened with each passing day. Cities fell quickly. Hitler's regime was collapsing. Finally, in May 1945, the war in Europe ended. Streets filled with celebration, nations rejoiced, but the men of the Ghost Army did not celebrate their achievements. Their missions were top secret. They could not tell anyone what they had done. Their entire contribution was locked away in classified files. Many returned to their old lives as artists, designers, and students. Some became famous painters. Others became architects, professors, or filmmakers. But what they had done during the war remained hidden for more than 40 years. In the 1990s, documents about the Ghost Army were finally declassified. Historians were stunned. The public learned that a small group of artists had deceived the German army more than 20 times. Experts estimated that their work saved tens of thousands of lives. Many commanders admitted they never knew who was behind the illusions that helped win crucial battles. Surviving members of the Ghost Army were invited to speak publicly for the first time. Some laughed, remembering the absurd moments, like inflating tanks under enemy fire. Others became emotional when talking about fear, loss, and close calls. They were finally recognized as heroes, not for fighting with guns, but for fighting with imagination. Modern armies around the world later studied their techniques. Inflatable decoys, sound warfare, and fake radio signals are now common tools. The legacy of these artists continues to shape military deception even today. The Ghost Army proved that war is not always won by bullets or bombs. Sometimes the human mind becomes the most powerful weapon. Their courage and creativity helped end World War II and saved countless lives. Their story shines as a reminder that even in the darkest times, imagination can become a force stronger than fear. They were soldiers, but not traditional ones. They were artists who fought a different kind of battle. And although their work was hidden for decades, their legacy now stands as one of the most remarkable chapters in wartime history.